one unifying reality that has occurred to me that I really think is the single all-pervasive thread. And that's before you're able to come on the spiritual path, it has to occur to you that there is an inward power that we can develop and that we can access. If you don't believe in that, then it's very difficult for you to be on the path of self-realization. You don't know what you're working with. You don't know why you would be working with it. From the time that little babies are born, the whole orientation of our senses just takes us out from our center. I was remembering when I was with a friend of mine when his daughter was born. I was with the couple when the daughter was born, and the little baby girl had just a little bit of distress in her lungs. So they whisked the baby away right away as soon as she was free of her mother's womb, and the umbilical cord had been cut. And the father followed the baby, and I followed the father. And we went into the more out of the hospital room into the care area. I don't know what you would call it. And the baby in a matter of very quick time, it was clear the baby was okay. And the father was leaning over his little daughter, and immediately she looks up at him and she reaches like this. Now, just in the moment, it was a real tear-inducing scene. It was hard not to be extremely moved by this child who's 2 minutes old, reaching up to grasp the hand of her father. But the other part of it that struck me is, look at that. Child is 2 minutes old, and already she is just reaching out from herself to sort of affirm a reality that is beyond her own inner experience. And when does it ever stop? We're just always doing that. And of course, it's the way we're made. So it's not inherently that we need to reverse the whole direction of our energy. Like many things on the spiritual path, and this is an important understanding, it's not so much that we reject one reality, we just expand and create a bigger reality all around it. So whatever it is that we're going to do in regard to our external life, it happens in the context of a bigger reality. So what I'm realizing is that for anyone to come onto the spiritual path, at some point there has to be an understanding that external life is an expression of something. Someone once asked me to define the word consciousness, because we use the word consciousness all the time, and they wrote to me, and rightly so, that we hear the word consciousness all the time, but I never hear it defined. And I realized, in fact, that was true. I never have heard it defined, and I take all my learning from Swamiji or from Master, and I wrote to Lakshman, who's Swamiji's secretary, who knows his writings, word by word all the way through, because he's worked with the editing and the publishing and so on. So I asked him the question about the definition of consciousness, and he actually pulled out for me a section of Swami's writing, and this is exactly what he said. There is no definition of consciousness, because to define something, we have to speak around it and explain it in terms of something else that you might know. If someone wants to know what a lemon tastes like, you could say, well, it's a little bit like an orange, but more sour. But if you've never eaten an orange, then you wouldn't be able to understand a lemon. If you were trying to talk about what snow is like, you would say, well, it's like rain, only it's colder. But what if you've never seen rain? You see, everything is always defined in terms of something else. But what Swamiji explained is that consciousness is the foundation of everything. There's simply no reference point. Consciousness can't be defined in terms of anything. Everything is defined in terms of consciousness, whether we know it or not. That when you back up beyond all definitions, the single reality that you find there is consciousness, Sat Chit Ananda. ever existing, ever conscious. Now the quality of conscious, that Satchidananda is bliss. So we use the word, and I have to admit that we use the word all the time, to mean attitude, energy, the way we relate to the world, the perception of reality that we have. You see, I'm giving it lots of as if now. But those are actually, in truth, expressions of consciousness. Because consciousness is there, then you can have attitudes. Because consciousness is there, you can have vibrations of energy, you can have perceptions of reality. But all of those things you see depend on consciousness. When Swamiji talks about Descartes' definition, I think, therefore I am, Swamiji says he really had it backwards. You are, you're conscious, and therefore you can think. It's not, thinking doesn't create consciousness, consciousness creates thinking. Well, somewhere in the course of our evolution is really the word, of our expanding awareness from unawareness to infinite awareness, part of that profound progression is, even if we don't have the word consciousness, we begin to understand that there is an inner reality here. There's a source to everything else that's happening. And these are knowings, these are awarenesses, these are realizations that grow up over many lifetimes. It's very interesting at the perspective of life that I am now. I'm 66. I'm hardly doddering toward the grave. Swami lived 20 more years, and those were extraordinarily productive years, and I'm hoping that God will give me the chance to be productive for a good bit longer. I think that there's a lot more that I feel that I could do to serve Master's work. So I'm counting on a little more time. At the same time, there's a certain perspective here that gives me an idea of how quickly an incarnation can go by, and how well, I guess the word I want to use is how long it takes us to progress. I certainly feel like this has been an extremely fruitful lifetime. I came to the spiritual path early. I've been as one-pointed as I am able to be for essentially this entire the adult portion of this incarnation. But still, it just goes by like that. And how many lifetimes does it take where we just get a little bit and a little bit and a little bit and a little bit, and we imagine that one incarnation is in some way separate than the other incarnation, but it's really no more separate than falling asleep and waking up. You know, as soon as you wake up in the morning, the totality of the day before is really right there. And you're just continuing from where you were, often literally. You know, just something that you left off when you went to sleep, you start up when you get up again. It moves in a continuous flow. And so it really is from incarnation to incarnation. By the grace of God, we forget a lot of the details. We no longer remember the specifics of our failures, and we no longer really remember the specifics of our successes. Although here's an interesting point that I don't know if this is valid or not, because I didn't hear it from Master or from Swamiji. I think it was presented by a novelist who used to write a lot of books about what she thought were past life memories. And they could well have been, vivid stories of other incarnations that she would present as novels. Why not? They're somebody's life story. But she said often when little children are doing things like dancing or singing or painting or whatever it is they might be doing, they're actually living out their accomplishments in those fields in previous incarnations. And because the discrimination is not highly developed in little children, they remember how talented and how effective they used to be in this. I took ballet when I was a small child, and I have a certain samskar for dance. I really never trained in this lifetime, and I never did it. But I feel it. And the feeling I have for it, I know is based on a lot of past life experiences. It's close to the surface, but this body is untrained. But when I was 6, on this theory that as little children we are living, we're living our previous lives as well as this one, I had such an extraordinary sense of grace and of flow and all of those things. Of course, children simply deceive themselves too. But for all the years, for many, many years, I remembered myself as a 6-year-old ballerina, especially this pink costume with silver ribbons around the tutu and the silver ribbons in my hair. Well, my mother had a photograph. Makes me laugh. Of course, I can't hold it up and show you. But, there I was 6. I was just, had my little arms held in this little, ballet position, but nothing of what I remember experiencing was in that photograph. And I'm sure what that photograph looked like is how others saw me. But it was not how I saw myself. I was carrying over some very strong memory. Far more important than any of that, though, was this profound determination in this lifetime to live in such a way as to live for happiness and to not allow myself to fall into suffering that could be avoided. And I didn't have the words until later, if I simply changed my consciousness. That suffering was not a necessity. It was a factor of my consciousness. It was a factor of how my attitude, of my desires. And if suffering was going to be the result of attitudes and desires I was holding, it seemed so self-evident to me that one should change those attitudes and desires. Why make yourself miserable? Why not just adjust to reality with willpower and determination? Now, of course, it's not as easy as I thought, but at least I had the right idea. But I remember saying to Swamiji, "Sir, I was born into comfort. I was born into a loving, supportive household. I never really had any particular tragedies or difficulties in my life, but I have such a determined attitude to find a way to live where happiness will really be my way of life." And I sort of shrugged, and then Swami looked at me and he said, "Past lives." It was an understanding you came to, and you were just born into it, because there's no break from one lifetime to the other. So there's this fascinating reality that happens where we accumulate understanding. More accurately, we expand our awareness from the most obvious, which is that I'm a physical body and I want to, self-aggrandizement and grab for myself and physical experiences. We get more and more refined artistically, culturally, interpersonally, and eventually spiritually, and we expand to a certain dimension, you might say. It's all directional. We embrace a certain percentage of our own potential, and even if our body dies, as inevitably our body will, and then it's born into a little tiny frame that doesn't know how to function, and it's given the grace of forgetfulness, so that we don't have to carry the weight of our, millions of incarnations in every single one. Nonetheless, if you want to put it that way, whatever level of awareness we have died with, we will be born with. That's not erased. We may be applying it in a whole new reality. The specific skills we learned may no longer be relevant, but the level of awareness, the expansion of our consciousness, which is the foundation stone of who we really are, that remains with us. I heard a story recently about a friend who was born in a European country and spent some time in a desert country where they used camels and lived as nomads. And as a small child, she knew exactly how to wrap her turban and how to drive her camel. And there was nothing in her own childhood in that life that would have taught her, but she just knew. It was just familiar to her. I heard of another woman, also as it happened, raised in Europe, who went to Africa, and she was as a very white white-skinned, blonde person in the middle of all these dark Africans, and she learned Swahili almost effortlessly. It was literally as if she remembered it. So it's not as if the actual external expression of our consciousness or our level of realization remains exactly the same, but our actual awareness does. I don't know if the distinctions are clear. So that at a certain point in our soul's journey, we begin to understand that the cultivation of that inner reality is not only more important in the long run than the cultivation of the external reality, because you see, everything external dissolves at death, and we cease to have access to the world that we live in while we're still inside this body. But everything about realization goes with us, as I was just describing, and our capacity, our consciousness, the magnitude of our consciousness is entirely present even when we're babies. It's sort of fun to look at pictures of oneself. And you sort of, as Swamiji put it about seeing himself, the specific example was he was 2 years old and he was in the bathtub and he was looking out over the edge. And Swami said he looked into the eyes of that photograph of himself and said, "Same old fellow, small body, but same old fellow, same consciousness, relating only to toys and tubs, but nonetheless same consciousness." So some part of us, after birth and death and birth and death and birth and death and birth and death, and going through this accumulated and losing, we begin to realize what needs to be cultivated is the inner reality, because that's all that I'll ever have. And so then we begin to start thinking about really how to do that. And sooner or later, if your longing is sincere enough, you are brought to the path. You are brought to the Guru. First you have teachings, first you have books, then you have teachers, then eventually you have a Guru. And this subject that we're talking about, how to use the power of affirmation, is all based, and has to be based, on a realization of the superior power of the internal world. Oh, I know what I was going to say. One more thought there that I didn't finish articulating. Is that even in terms of whatever we may desire of the manifested world and of self-expression of our inner consciousness, it will come to us more if we develop the foundation. If we know what the source is, and the closer we stand to the source, you see, the more power you have in the expressions. If you live just at the periphery and you're trying to manipulate the whole thing from the outer edge, you're just not standing in the decisive place. And the decisive place of everything, whether external or internal, is the source of consciousness, because consciousness is everything. Everything else is defined by it. So you see what that means is that everything else is a manifestation of consciousness. And if the consciousness is in order, the entire manifestation is in order. I remember a friend of mine, a very active, serviceful person, but he had this wonderful ability to always remember that consciousness was everything. And you'd see him sometimes he had a funny habit in group meetings that took me a little while to figure out, which is that every time he would feel either the energy of the group or his own energy drifting away from center, he would sort of take command of the group energy until it was brought back to center. Sometimes it would seem like non sequiturs, but one way or another, if there was any negative energy building, if there was critical or discouraged energy building, if the conversation was becoming too worldly, too materialistic, he would just bring it back to center, and he would sort of, the way I would describe it is he would take over the energy of the room until, with his own vibrations, either by words or however he worked it, until it was brought back, till the consciousness was focused again. And then he would sort of let go of control and we could go back and do our business. But whatever it is that we had to do, he always knew that unless our consciousness was where it needed to be, nothing else would work. So idea of affirmations, both as a formal practice and also just as an entire attitude toward life, is attuning into the fact, first of all, of the foundational reality of consciousness. If consciousness is right, everything will follow. Swamiji, in the early years of Ananda, there was always so much that was going on, and so many different areas were being developed in so many different ways, and he was never a leader who made all the decisions himself. He kept a very clear and attentive eye to the overall flow of things, but he didn't always know or want to know, and he definitely didn't want to be in charge of all the details. And sometimes people would try to bring Swami up to date with details and facts, but his only interest was to know whether the energy was right, whether the consciousness was right, whether the attitudes of the people working on it were right. Because he said, if the energy is right, everything will come out right. There's many different ways to achieve the same goal. There's many different choices you could make. And if he wasn't going to make all the decisions, he had to let other people make many of the decisions. And even if his choice wouldn't have been exactly the same, if the consciousness was right, then it would always come out the way it should. Or it would always come out well. The consciousness right meaning solution-oriented, kind, devoted, uplifted in its intention, not ego-based. I mean, there's lots of other ways to define it. So the practice of affirmations as a practice is really the practice of putting our consciousness in the right place. There's books written called The Power of Positive Thinking, and even though some of that particular phrase, in fact, and that particular perennial best-selling book has become almost a cliche. The reason it's become a cliche is because it's true. There is this tremendous power in focusing our thoughts in the right direction, in the right way. And there's also a self-defeating power that can orient us toward problems rather than solutions. When Swamiji was writing his Superconscious Living course, he emphasized very strongly the simple fact that we need to be solution-oriented, is how he put it. It took me a long time to sort of grasp what that phrase means. He used it for a while, and I had to keep thinking of it. But it came to me actually in an experience I had within myself of personal transformation of an extremely subtle nature, but that absolutely changed my orientation. One of the karmic syndromes that I was born with and have had to struggle with, and to be fair to myself, I think to an enormous extent it has dissolved at this point. I always hesitate to say that I'm free of it, but I'm certainly not oriented as much that way. I was very insecure and had an inclination to expect myself to be unable to do it rather than able to do it. It was a kind of a paradox, because on other levels I was very confident, but there was this underlying anxiety. And I would say that my subconscious mind was oriented towards self-doubt. And so whenever anything would happen, if you think of your consciousness as a marble, which of course makes no sense at all, but if you think of your consciousness as a marble, and you know that a smooth marble will just roll in whatever direction the surface it's on is oriented. If it's absolutely level, the marble will just sit there. But if there's even the slightest tilt in one direction or another, the marble will just roll in that direction. Well, my subconscious mind was tilted toward anxiety that I wouldn't succeed, self-doubt, fear, whatever you call it. So every time I tried to make forward progress, whenever I would pause even slightly, because it was tilted, it would roll downhill. It would roll down toward doubt rather than up toward confidence, or even just sitting in the middle. After 12 years on the spiritual path of continuous effort, I'm not even necessarily on that particular point, but just continuous effort to raise consciousness. Because self-doubt is just a vibration. It's not a fixed fact. There's no indentation in the gray matter of your brain that forces you to be that way. It's just an energy pattern in the chakras that pulls more energy to it. There's no fixed reality to it. It's a pattern that has been created, and by the same token, it's a pattern that could easily be unmade. And it also exists on a certain vibration of reality, a certain actual perception of reality, perception of oneself as a limited being, as unable to, as not really a channel of light, as subject to conditional love. You can have all kinds of things that you want, but they only exist on a certain level of reality, and that level of reality has a certain vibration. You can either satisfy it or try to satisfy it on that level, or you can simply begin to vibrate on a higher level, and then this vibration will just cease to exist because you won't perceive it anymore. Once you're at a higher, more subtle level, everything underneath just no longer influences you. So I can't say that I actually fought the battle directly, but a collateral victory. They often say collateral damage. I'll say collateral victory. And this point was practically on my 36th birthday. The orientation of my consciousness shifted almost imperceptibly, but enough. Enough so that when the marble was at rest, it rolled away from doubt into faith and confidence. And it was a total revolution. And it really taught me that how powerfully just the orientation of our thinking can be in everything that we do. Because if we train ourselves to have faith, to have confidence, then so many things follow from that, and so many detrimental things just don't even occur to us. So to my way of thinking, the practice of affirmation has two dimensions, and they're both of enormous importance. One is the formal practice, and I'll speak to that in a few moments, where we really choose word formulas and use them powerfully to orient our awareness always in the direction that we're trying to go. The other way is they're actually not so unrelated, but also training ourselves in all circumstances, whether we're doing a formal practice of affirmations or not. But in all circumstances, we train ourselves to always remember the happy ending. That's one of the, just a beautiful, simple way to think about the spiritual path. It was given to me first by a mathematician friend who told me that in working out mathematical equations, if the answer was not beautiful and harmonious, he said, it wasn't the correct answer. Because mathematics is this extraordinarily gorgeous system of the way reality fits together. And the way reality fits together is in harmony and in rhythm. It's not jagged edges. And this man, who was a mathematician, said he didn't believe in God. And he didn't believe in a transcendent purpose of life. But he realized that if life was just this experience ending in death, that was neither harmonious nor beautiful. That his equations ended more beautifully than life itself did. And in the most delightful manner, he realized that he didn't yet have the right answer to the equation of life. And so he started exploring the spiritual path and finding the path of Sanatana Dharma and self-realization. It was a happy ending. No matter how many difficult and seemingly tragic chapters there were, all of those tragedies eventually resolve themselves into something completely else. I mean, what could have been more tragic than the crucifixion of Jesus Christ? Here's an avatar come to renew an ancient faith, to bring the power of redemption to all these people whose sincere longing for goodness and elevation actually caused him to incarnate. And what is the response that he receives? The response that he receives is to be arrested, to be persecuted, and ultimately to be crucified like a common thief. And as if his whole work was going to be obliterated, and most of his friends and companions did not have the courage to stick with him, but ran away from him. I mean, it just couldn't have been a more embarrassing, despicable, unpleasant ending. But what was the result of the crucifixion? The result of the crucifixion was the resurrection. And the fact that he just came out of what, from the human mind's point of view, was the worst, most, fearful end for an incarnation. And Jesus just stepped right out of it. Literally resurrected his body, walked with his disciples. The Bible, people know about his resurrection on Easter morning. But after that, for some 40 days, Jesus was in many different places, and many different disciples saw him. Not just one or two, but even large crowds of disciples. And he didn't just sort of shimmer in and speak in a kind of spectral voice. He walked, he talked, he shared dinner. He was just there. He came back from what everyone thought was impossible to return from. And of course, Jesus is not the only example. There's several examples in Autobiography of a Yogi, and many other examples of masters through history. Because the only possible answer to life is that there's always a happy ending. And even the way the tragedy spins, and that's the point of the crucifixion, it seemed like such a tragedy, but the drama of that crucifixion lent so much power to the resurrection. And the courage and the sacrifice of the crucifixion lent so much power to the promise of salvation. You see, it all comes around to that. And affirmation is the commitment to realize that no matter what it seems like in this particular situation, it's always going to resolve in light. You work that with your word formulas, you work that with your visualizations, with chants, with prayers, whatever we're using to pull the mind and to pull the heart into that direction. But it also just becomes the way we look at everything. I laughed many years ago. I was with someone in a car, and it was a car that we owned, and we didn't have very much money, and the car had been a gift, and it was an old car, but it was the only car we had, and if we didn't have that car, if it didn't work, we didn't really have the resources to replace it. There were the whole lot of conditions. And the car absolutely causelessly completely stopped dead in the middle of the road. Fortunately, it wasn't the middle of the freeway, it was just the middle of the road. We were not in any danger. Simultaneously, both of us knowing absolutely nothing about the car or cars in general. He said, the car is ruined, it will never be able to fix it. I said, oh, it's something small, it won't take much to get it running again. We actually literally spoke at the same time. Neither of us knew anything, but there was the orientation of the mind. And far more insidious than you may appreciate. That orientation of the mind, you see, feeds constantly on itself. Because whenever the marble is not being pulled strongly in one direction, or whenever the marble is at rest, it will roll in the direction that you're oriented. That's why Swamiji in his Superconscious Living course made such a point. Be solution-oriented. Do not be problem-oriented. Now that doesn't mean that you're not realistic, that you're not aware of what's going on, that you're not capable of perceiving a situation, but you perceive the situation, and what is your expectation? What is your articulated thought? What is the feeling of the heart? Now also bear in mind, these are habits. There's no fixed rock called your response. Your response is just the way you're oriented. And pay close attention to yourself. Pay close attention to yourself, especially in small ways. Just watch yourself. When there's a bump in the road, what do you think? Oh, the axle's about to break. Or do you think, well, a friend of mine is a twin, and he laughs because he and his twin sister, he said, were like opposites. And he describes the time when they were about 2 years old, and they were, I guess, on an airplane, and the airplane hit turbulence. And every time the airplane jerked, his sister began to cry. And every time the airplane jerked, he went, whee! Just like that. And I've always thought, there you have it. It's like there's turbulence in the air, and do you just think, wow, this is a great and glorious ride? Or do you become panic-stricken that this is the beginning of the end? And affirmations are that constant affirming that even if my worst fears are going to be realized and my darkest perception of this situation is going to prove true, it's just a step on the way to the happy ending. Isn't that beautiful? Happily ever after, that's the Walt Disney movie. Just as a small point. But what I wanted to say is, and that's also the way you see that you magnetize it to you. Because this world operates, this is an energy universe. As I've mentioned several times, there's nothing fixed here. It appears to be fixed, but the only reason it appears to be fixed is because it's vibration, it's energy in motion. But it's energy in motion, and that motion creates a magnetic field, and that magnetic field draws energy to it. So every time we affirm a negative outcome, every time we allow a change, an unexpected and perhaps unwelcome or unanticipated change in circumstance, to cause us to affirm an outcome, a negative outcome, then we've created another vortex of energy that makes that negative outcome all the more likely to occur, because we've set up a resonance within us for negativity and darkness to come. And the active power of affirmations is a way to work with the mind if it's wrongly oriented. The most important thing in affirmations, and it's a very good idea to at least start with affirmations that have been written, well, especially the ones that Master wrote and especially the ones that Swamiji wrote, are written from the highest vibration. And affirmations can be a prayer from Whispers from Eternity. The book of Whispers from Eternity by Master is, in a very interesting way, it's a whole book of affirmations. It's a whole book of the affirmation of the right attitude. What Master does in Whispers from Eternity, from the point of view of the subject that we're talking about now, is so extraordinarily subtle. Because what he does is he systematically or comprehensively, by the time you go through every one of those whispers, he deals with virtually every area of life that troubles people. Loneliness, fatigue, disappointment in love, financial hard times, ill health, war, violence, just sort of all the things that can happen to a person. Defeat, betrayal, everything that can happen to a person. Then Master writes a prayer, and that prayer tells us how to relate to what happened to us and how to turn what happened to us, even if it's very dark and difficult, to turn it toward the light. For example, he talks about one of his prayers is, make me like the blossoming tree that even when hit with the axe blows of destructive words from others, or even if chopped off at the root by unfeeling the unfeeling violence of the world around me still showers sweet-smelling blossoms even on those who attack. So what he's really talking about is people coming after you, people pulling you down, people destroying your hopes, maybe even taking your life from you. But what is the right attitude to have? Well, if it can't be helped, instead of anger, we become like Christ, Jesus on the cross. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Well, that's a very high standard indeed. But that's where we have to go eventually, so we might as well at least head in the right direction now. And Master talks about ill health and various other things. And then in the affirmations themselves that he writes, he puts such a powerful, all-pervasive thought forward that it sweeps all of our limitations into it. That's why it's very nice to start with the affirmations that Master wrote. But a very important aspect of affirmations is that we need to challenge ourselves sufficiently to expand beyond who we are already. But we have to make sure that our affirmative thinking doesn't become mere wishful thinking. This is a very subtle line. But mere wishful thinking is often based on weakness, is based on a weak will, a lack of willpower or a lack of energy. And so we really want things to come out well, and we hope that things will come out well, but there's no commitment on our part to generate the energy to make them come out well. And then affirmative thinking becomes mere wishful thinking. Now, how can you tell the difference? Well, it's a vibration that you get used to, and you feel it in yourself too. To be affirmative is to say, not merely I want to be well, but I'm going to do what I need to do to heal myself. Sometimes thinking about healing, I realize many people want to be well, but how many people really want to look at the causes of what's making them ill and then face and overcome those? You see, true affirmative thinking is to exercise your willpower to redirect your energy and then use that redirected energy to manifest, not merely to be rescued from or freed on this path that we're on. So we have to also think in terms of using affirmations that really, that we can really believe in and that we can really put our will behind. An example that I've told you before, but it's my own experience and I can speak with strength behind it, plus it perfectly illustrates this. When I was really trying to work through what I mentioned before, this orientation more toward doubt than toward confidence, my mind would often run away from me, and thoughts and feelings would come in that I couldn't always easily control. And there's an expression in science that says, nature abhors a vacuum, which is to say, if one force leaves a space, it will not remain empty. There won't be a vacuum. Something will come in to fill it. So if we're having thoughts and feelings and attitudes that we know are not serving the cause of our expanded consciousness, then we can't just remove those negative thoughts so easily. What we have to do is we have to push them aside with a more dynamic and a more positive force. And this is where the formal practice of formal affirmations can have be such a powerful, life-changing thing. You might think it wouldn't, but if you understand that it's all just energy, and it's all just the orientation of your energy, you could see how thoughts directed in the right way, if you're thinking different, you are different. The only difference between a saint and a sinner, as Master said, is how they behave. That's so funny to think about, because of course, you know, a sinner behaves like a sinner and a saint like a saint. But you see, as soon as that self-destructive, evil-producing person ceases to be self-destructing and becomes kind and serviceable, he is a saint. At that point, he's no longer a sinner. I mean, of course, there may be a a gap between the two parts. But you see what I mean? It's only the way we're oriented. So we need to choose an affirmation that we genuinely believe in. And if it's beautiful, it helps. There's a wonderful one of Masters for prosperity. I go forth in perfect faith, in the power of omnipresent good, to bring me what I need at the time I need it. Now, one might feel I go forth in the phrase in perfect faith. Maybe you have a little trouble with the word perfect, but we definitely go forth because we don't ever sit still. So if we're going to go forth, then we can say, I go forth in perfect faith. Now, maybe that's too big for some of you, but for many people, that's just the right size affirmation. Perfect faith. And then every time you see it, say it, you can kind of have this expanding picture of, even if I don't have perfect faith, what would perfect faith look like? And then you have that beautiful phrase, in the power of omnipresent good. And the balancing point of that affirmation, which when I've used it, I've always loved, is maybe I don't feel my own faith is perfect, but the power of omnipresent good. What a glorious phrase that is. And every time you say it, especially with concentration, at least in that moment, you get to contemplate the power of omnipresent good. And all of our thoughts and ideas about God and Guru, encapsulated by the image of omnipresent good, and how much power omnipresent good has. And then we think of dark circumstances of people being cruel to each other, being imprisoned, or being ill, or being lost, or being homeless. But if good is omnipresent, and there is power in omnipresent good, and we have at least some faith in the power of omnipresent good, and you see how you can, by just carefully concentrating and visualizing as you say it, the power of picturing in whatever way is meaningful to you, the words that you're using, give them so much more energy, and to say them not like I go forth in perfect faith, the power of omnipresent good, that won't do you much good. And you see that's the difference between wishful thinking and true positive thinking. I go forth in perfect faith in the power of omnipresent good. You put your willpower, you put your concentration, you put every part of your consciousness behind the feeling, the words, the meaning, the image, the consequences of it. And you reduce your sense of past and present to a single focus in the now. You're not thinking about failures of the past. You're not thinking about possibilities of the future. You're just, I go forth in perfect faith in the power of omnipresent good. And then, to bring me what I need at the time I need it. Now, we usually say this affirmation thinking in terms of abundance, especially financial abundance. I need money, I need support, I need opportunity, whatever it might be. But what the affirmation really says is just to bring me what I need at the time I need it. Whatever that is. I have perfect faith in omnipresent good to bring me what I need at the time I need it. And what that also sets you up for is a much more expansive definition of what you need and what omnipresent good will bring you. And one may wish for a certain outcome and may have in mind a certain outcome, but what you're really affirming is faith and joyful acceptance and the belief in the happy ending. And the belief that God is always in charge and He's bringing me just what I need at the time that I need it. And if what He brings me is more challenge and more lack and more opportunity to repeat the affirmation because I still need to learn, well, that's just what I need at the time I need it. But you see how total the freedom is that we are affirming there? And yet it still connects. It still connects to my present necessity and the little bit of faith that I may have. And we can build on that. I have I have perfect faith. I go forth in perfect faith in the power of omnipresent good to bring me what I need at the time I need it. Why do I worry about anything? There's certain things have been coming to Ananda in such beautiful ways lately. I say, these all need to go into the big file called, why do I ever worry about anything? And I think that's the affirmation we want above all. God is in charge, and whatever He brings us exactly what we need at the time we need it, because of that blissful, omnipresent good. We have one question tonight, so let me hear what that question is.
Okay, this question refers back to the dancing you spoke about.
To dancing,
It
okay.
says, you spoke about your love of dance. Mm-hmm. What do you think of the Rasa Leela dance and the Sankirtan movement that thinks that you can advance spiritually by dancing for and with God?
Well, I mean, anything in life is a potential to expand your consciousness. It's not, I mean, anything that's uplifting and not debased or degrading. It depends on your karma. I mean, there's a certain point when all movement, even of thought, even of breath, even of heartbeat, has to give way to stillness. But there's a stillness at the heart of movement that people can also find. He seems to, the questioner seems to be referring to something extremely specific with which I'm not familiar. But I think what we have to do is we have to discover within ourselves the unique ways in which spirit flows and measure the efficacy of a teaching simply by its fruits. When Swami Kriyananda asked, not Swami Kriyananda, when Jesus Christ was asked the question, how can you tell a true prophet from a false one? Which could be asked, how can you tell a true teaching from a false one? How can you tell a true method, spiritual method from a false one? And the answer is, by their fruits ye shall know them. Which is to say, it's proven by the experiment. And it's also relative. Someone who has a deep capacity to sit in silent meditation and commune with God without any external expression of that would be going backwards to go into dance. If someone is very restless, very physically oriented and really, or kinetically oriented, which I think is the right word, but needs to feel things through their body before it has any reality to them, such a person could find that their awareness could be greatly expanded by directing all that energy toward in a more uplifted and refined way. If, by contrast, the dancing is just very rajasic and doesn't center you but merely exhausts you, or it's very sensually oriented, even if the overlay is spiritual, but in fact it doesn't actually lift your energy to the higher chakras. You have to see it by the fruits. And you can tell the fruits of a practice by looking at the people who practice it. I often say if you're trying to find out what your spiritual path is, it may not be within your own state of realization to evaluate the consciousness of the master. But if you look at those people who follow that teaching and have followed it for a long time, especially those you feel who have followed it both sincerely, intelligently, and energetically, and you ask yourself, who are they? And is that person and the way they express in the world, is that my ideal? Is that who I would like to become? Because that is who you will become. So if you're looking at a particular method, in this case dancing, to find out whether it can draw you closer to God, be very attentive not only to your own experience, but to the experience of those who are farther along on this path. Do they in their life exemplify the kind of refined, virtuous, blissful being that you yourself aspire to? And if they look like who you want to become, then at least for you, at least at this time, then it's a valid practice. And experiment and see. It may be, though, as I say, not a good practice for someone else. It just depends. All through spiritual teaching, people sing and dance to God. It's just the most natural thing in the world to do. The body has to be used for something, and it can manifest through it. I was reading about the life of Ramakrishna, and how often he would go when they were doing kirtan, as the way the disciples described it, and he would dance with a grace that all those watching him, they said it was not human. It was literally the divine energy just flowing through him, but it moved as dance. And it was as if, as they described it, that he showed where dance comes from and what it's really meant to be, because it was nothing of the mind. It was just the pure spirit running through him. And so in that sense, you see, everything can be divine. And if it's a practice that leads you toward that, then it's a valid practice for you. Well, that brings us to the end of this particular session, and all I can say is joy to you, and God bless you.